Welcome to Chariots of Flowers. My name is Coralie, and on today's episode, I will be musing about academia as an aesthetic. Now, of course, whenever we think about the academic aesthetic, we tend to think about dark academia right away, which to me is a very valid line of reasoning, mostly because dark academia, according to as far as back as my memory goes, is sort of like the original, and I say this with quotation marks in my hands as I speak, original academic aesthetic. And I think it dates back all the way back to 2015, but I myself was not familiar with the academic aesthetic up until 2019, and I became aware of it mostly because I think of just Pinterest and Tumblr, and I think I found it as just a keyword. I think either I was trying to find clothing inspiration on Pinterest for college wardrobe to fit the fall aesthetic, and I wanted something in that line, and then I magically bumped into the word dark academia, and then that kind of made everything click in my brain and all the neurotransmitters just went off in my head. Or I think as a way to chill out in between studying in college, I decided to open up a Tumblr in 2019, and then I somehow came across that word, and then it kind of became my go-to keyword to reblog things for a while. I can't remember which one came first, but either way, through one of those social media channels, I came across the word and I became obsessed with it, and it stuck. And it was only maybe a few years later, so 2020, during COVID being completely with everyone kind of going to lockdown and going through TikTok and Tumblr and Pinterest, but mostly TikTok and all that stuff, kind of finding all these different variations of academia as subgenres and aesthetics that came along, as well as a renewed interest in dark academia, which for me was really cool to see that kind of come back again, and then kind of see all these different iterations that made sense to whoever was kind of into academia but maybe did not want to embrace the Donna Tartt secret history academia, or the Dorian Gray stuff or the Shakespearean stuff, but found things that kind of suited their lifestyle and interests and headspaces at the time. I found more things about academia aesthetics through the Aesthetic Wiki, which I find to be a completely fascinating resource for all things tied to subgenres, subcultures, all sorts of aesthetics and cores that you can think of somehow. I don't know if it's the one person or if it's a group of people, or I think it's a whole community of people who literally created a whole wiki fandom page dedicated to just looking up aesthetics. So it's a really great encyclopedia for aesthetics, which I think is fairly new, because I remember there was a time in which you would only know of an aesthetic if you just ran into it on social media, or maybe through a playlist or something, or on Tumblr, and then it kind of just stuck and that's it. But it was either you knew it or you didn't. But thanks to this website, it kind of made it a lot easier to find something in particular if you're looking for a specific vibe or aesthetic, and it kind of points to the right resources. I highly recommend it. But when I was kind of looking up academia, basically doing research for this recording, I kind of ran into a bunch of categories for academia subgenres. But for just to make sure that this rambling, this musing that I'm about to go on makes sense to everyone, just to ensure that we're all on the right page, I'm just going to kind of read what I think we can all agree is sort of the definition of the academia aesthetic. And I kind of, again, borrowed it from Aesthetics Wiki, and I'm kind of borrowing it from the Dark Academia page, mostly because it is kind of referenced as the original academia aesthetic on the website. And then to me, it also is sort of the original academia aesthetic. So I'm just going to use that general definition and then kind of piggyback off of that and then go down my own personal rabbit hole. But anyway, here is sort of the definition of academia that we can all sort of use as a foundation for this. So, academia, an aesthetic that revolves around literature. Technically, it's classic literature, but I'm going to go into that later on. The pursuit of self-discovery and a general passion for knowledge and learning. And in the subgenres of academia, so it's a really, really long list of academia subgenres. Obviously, I'm not going to read you every single one because that would take a very, very long time to read. And also, when I was going through all of them, I made the mistake to mistake slash just recurring habit of opening up every single tab for every single one of them, and I could just see my internet, just the little internet program, when it's not responding and it keeps on just swirling in confusion because it's taking forever to load. That literally started happening because there's just so many of them. So I literally had to look at it, take the note down, click the X, and then see a little pop-up being oh, the server is not responding. Would you like to close it or keep waiting? But I kind of didn't want to miss a term in case I kind of want to use it. So my program got a little pissy with me for a bit, but I made it through. We made it through. Here I am. So I'm just going to read you a very simplified version of it. So we got Dark Academia, which again, the original aesthetic. We got Light Academia, which is basically Dark Academia, but a happier, optimistic, cheerful version, if that makes sense. So it's kind of think of Dark Academia as the angsty firstborn sibling, who's prone to melancholy, or just really just angsty and likes wearing black and wool in the middle of summer despite a heat wave going on. And then you got Light Academia, who was sort of the younger strawberry shortcake vibe student who likes to study for fun but likes to read lighthearted stuff that would not induce heart pangs and feelings being undone at the seams and possibly nightmares. All joking, of course. And then, going back to the list, there is Chaotic Academia. So, basically, I feel like this one can really apply to anyone regardless of what kind of academia they apply to. I don't want to call it the hot mess academia, but it's more the rough around the edge student, the student who is a little, a little unorthodox, does their own thing, doesn't feel the need to be as polished as their light and dark contemporaries. Maybe they like wearing a little ripped jeans and combat boots and writing with multiple colored pens, and maybe even instead of using a fountain pen or something like that. But drinks a little bit too much caffeine for their own good, stays up a little late, their notebooks are a little all over the place, but they have their act under control, they still have their studying under control, they know what they're studying, and they know a lot. They might be a little sleep deprived, but they got it going on. And then we got Art Academia, which I think is a little self-explanatory. And I know on the page they just kind of kept it to just like visual arts, but because I studied arts in college, I am going to take the executive decision and kind of throw performing arts and literary arts into that. So I think anyone who really embraces the whole academia subgenre, but really kind of spends most of their energy focusing more on the art side of things, whether that's, poetry, painting, sculpture, drawing, dance, theater, music, the list goes on. But that's sort of academia with that particular emphasis in mind. And there's also one that's, I forget the name of it, but it's also just called STEM academia, where it's just academia but with that particular STEM emphasis. And then we got green academia, which is really academia but an emphasis on earth sciences. So think biology, botany, all that fun stuff. And then we got cryptid academia, which I never heard of before, but I thought was pretty cool. It's it's basically like Gravity Falls or like X Files or like, I don't know, like Stranger Things, but make it academia. So it's kind of like academia for like the conspiracy theorists and the people who like to go, you know, visit abandoned houses and try to look for like ghosts or vampires and investigate like urban legends in their small town, and maybe they like take little clippings of like newspaper articles that talk about like a random Bigfoot or like Loch Ness monster sighting, and they have it like up in their room, and they have like a little like red like yarn, and they like pin it all over the place, kind of like that like Pepe Sylvia sketch from It's Always Sunny in Philadelphia. It kind of like that, except like perhaps there is an actual Pepe Sylvia. But I think that one's like pretty cool. I think it's pretty rad. And then we got pastel academia. So, it's like light academia, but very, very soft. I wouldn't say cutesy, but I think it's an even softer, like marshmallow version of light academia. Mellow and relaxing, kind of like the Lo-Fi Girl on YouTube. And then we got witchy academia, which, again, self-explanatory, but I think if there's maybe one pop cultural reference that I think all of us can kind of agree on when we think of witchy academia is just Hogwarts. That's it. It's really just that whole, I mean, like, you can also arguably say that Hogwarts is a whole completely different thing. But I think a lot of the witchy academia aesthetic mood boards are heavily inspired by Hogwarts, or at least the version of Hogwarts that we see in the film adaptation of the Harry Potter books. Because if I remember the books correctly, they kind of have the way that the author depicts the school in the books is kind of its own thing. Like, it doesn't have like the sleek uniform and the whole vibe. Like, the vibe is there, but the drip and the whole thing that we really blows our minds about Hogwarts, a lot of it we kind of get from the film. And it's really all the depiction of Hogwarts in the film that really kind of influences witchy academia as we understand it right now. Maybe with time, that should be interesting to see. I think people might try to slowly start to revisit what that particular what witchy aesthetic could possibly look like. I'd be curious to see what that looks like. But for now, I think Hogwarts is probably like a good like immediate point reference. But a lot of it is just like witchcraft study and all that stuff. But the visual aesthetic, Hogwarts. And then we got Goblin Academia, which is another one I had never heard of. But I was familiar with Goblin Core. So imagine Goblin Core, but make it academia. And then you have Goblin Academia. And then, last but not least, we got miscellaneous academia, which I kind of like renamed myself and called rabbit hole academia, because the idea behind this is sort of this whole idea of like maybe you have like a particular like niche or hyper fixation, and you kind of like, you know how like whenever like you get like really obsessed with like a super like random thing, like for example, like for people who had like ancient Egypt phases when we're all kids, because like I know I kind of had that myself. So it's like, imagine like you kind of like sit there and like maybe you go to like your local bookstore or library, or you're like you have the Scholastic Book Fair going on at your school, so you get like all these like ancient Egyptian books, and you just kind of like that's all you consume outside of like your academic requirements and scholarly requirements in school. So you kind of just sit there and just like memorizing like every single thing about like mummification and pyramids and like cat adoration and all the names of the kings and queens and like the gods and the goddesses and the creation myth and the Nile and all that stuff. And then so you go through all the books, and then you go on the internet, and maybe you go on Wikipedia and you catch a documentary, and you just really go down this like really really like this really deep rabbit hole for like hours or days or maybe even months on end, and you kind of just become like this like amateur like expert on this. Like you basically should have a PhD in this, but the only reason why you don't have a PhD in it is because you just didn't formally get one. But you're like a PhD expert in the subject matter of your hyperfixation, all but in name. Okay, so all that being said, I think that when it comes to defining academia, I think one thing that well, not just one thing, but a bunch of things that I kind of think we need to separate from academia is that it's not just about, oh, it's a it's a boarding school thing or it's a college thing or a university thing. I think that anyone can be really into academia, into that subgenre, regardless of your current education level. You could be a middle schooler and really, really be about that life. You could be, yeah, you could literally be a first year in college and be into that. You could be a recent graduate and be into that. Or you could have been out of school for a while and still really embrace the academia lifestyle. You don't have to be a student to do it. And I think one thing a lot of people tend to neglect as well is that unfortunately, because of how the aesthetic was formed online, it kind of became synonymous with European and American, mostly European literature, and a lot of the cultural references that we use in formulating the images and sort of the vibe that we now associate with dark academia that kind of bled onto the other academia, I think is not always the most inclusive. You shouldn't be disqualified from the academia aesthetic if, you know, you're not into reading classic literature from like 3 centuries ago, or if you would prefer to study a language outside of the Latin and Romance language groups, or perhaps you prefer to study South American and African and Asian and Indigenous American mythology instead of Greek and Roman mythology. Again, there's nothing wrong with studying any mythology of your choice, but I don't think that one should limit themselves to a particular field of study or expertise because they feel that it's somehow going to disqualify them from being academia. One thing about academia that I really became attracted to is that yes, a lot of it is borrowed from a school structure because the school structure is an academic structure, but a lot of the things to me that makes it great is that we're really latching on to subjects that truly fascinate us. It doesn't matter what it is, but it really fascinates us. And in really taking the time to voluntarily take this on and study it and talk about it and really go into passionate discourses about it, whether it's two-sided or it's a group setting, or perhaps it's a friend or a family member who kind of just nods and smiles and kind of lets us ramble on about it for hours on end, is that in learning these things, we sort of discover a part of ourselves in it, or perhaps we even reinvent ourselves in it, or we discover pieces of our souls that we didn't even know exist, or we knew existed, but we didn't quite have a name for it until we came upon that literary text, or that essay, or that recording, or that lecture, or that thing that kind of really fascinates us, or really kind of we hear it or we read it and we're like, oh yes, that's it, that's exactly what I love about this, or oh my god, that makes so much sense. Like, we sort of find meaning in our own lives and through our own identity through this thing. Not that we identify ourselves through our quality of work, because I think what we should do, I think, as consumers of the academia subgenre, is that we should take away the need for academic validation from that, to understand that it's not just a school thing, it's a life thing. The idea of studying for pleasure and meaning and soul journey's sake is, I think, what makes it beautiful. And I think keeping that in mind as we sort of embrace this lifestyle, when you kind of keep that as the central tenet for what academia should be, the passion and pursuit of scholarship for scholarship's sake, and through scholarship's sake find personal meaning through that, and gratification and pleasure for pleasure's sake through that, then I think it no longer even becomes a subgenre or even just an aesthetic. It's just a lifestyle. So there's that for today. This has been Chariots of Flowers. Thank you all so much for listening, and see you all next week. Bye.